Okay. You can't tell Reverend Kyle that I've uploaded this video. I know he's trying to encourage all of you to start a practice of morning prayer during COVID, if you haven't already done so. And if you don't believe me, you can look up his YouTube video on spiritual practices, morning prayer from March 19th. Now let me tell you a secret. And this is especially for those of you who aren't morning people. Morning is not the only prayer hour of the day. In fact, there are 7 of them. That's right, 7. You know the psalm that says, 7 times a day will I praise you. And that means if you've missed the first one, there are 6 more chances to pray in any given day. And so there's morning prayer, but there's also terce, sext, none, vespers, compline, and vigils. And that's Latin for the hours of the day counted from sunrise. So terce is 3 hours after sunrise. Sext is 6 hours, and none is 9 hours. And vespers means evening. Compline means completion, for the completion of the day. And vigils, well, we know that term. Prime is the first hour of daylight, and so it's another name for that dreaded hour of prayer, morning prayer. Note, terce is a happy 3 hours after morning prayer, and so about 9 a.m. Sext is 6 hours after sunrise, so about noon. None is 3 in the afternoon, and vespers is at twilight. Compline is just before turning in for the night, and vigils, and other dreaded prayer hour, but actually perhaps one of the most deeply satisfying experiences of silence you might have, happens around 3 a.m. So, take your pick. There are 7 prayer hours: prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, compline, and vigils. And now, if you're in a monastery, however, it might be a bit problematic if you are missing, say, the prayer hours until, say, you finally decide to get out of bed, because you might have your abbess or your abbot knock on your cell door. But to my knowledge, none of us are professed monastics, so this is between you and God, and all the other people living in your household, and all the demands on your schedule. Right. So, aside from your natural rhythms, you want to take into account the natural demands of your vocational life, expressed first in the state of your life in relation to others. Are you married? Are you celibate, either by calling or life circumstance? Are you a parent with children at home right now? All this is going to influence when you choose to pray. And finally, you'll want to take into consideration the demands of your vocational life as it relates to service beyond your immediate home. You can actually can you actually, for instance, take a break at 3 in the afternoon at your office? Is your boss going to let you do that? And now with COVID, it might actually be fun to experiment praying at different times of the day. It gives us a certain kind of freedom to understand what our best natural rhythms are. And finally to consider is that maybe God is calling you to be praying at a certain time during a certain season of your life. Of course, you can pray all 7 of the prayer hours. Don't let me stop you. But if you're not a professed monastic, where everything in the monastery is ordered around the often very rigorous schedule of the divine office, aka prayer hours, this can be challenging. That's okay. We've figured this out in church history for the rest of us, those who pray at home and in the church. And I will summarize that story in a moment. But before I do, a brief word about prayer generally. I don't want to give the impression at all that you're doing something wrong if you're praying at a time outside of these prayer hours. In fact, you're probably doing something very, very right. Someone recently told me that they don't really know how to pray because they're just talking to God all the time. Right. So that's the point. The The prayer hours are simply one way of fulfilling the call of Scripture we find in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 to, quote, pray continually. So the story. The early church was, as many of you will know, a persecuted lot, intermittently. There were times of freedom and times of persecution, but that means they didn't have continual freedom to gather publicly to pray. It depended actually on the whims of any given emperor. So, before Constantine in the year 325, who made Christianity the religion of the Roman Empire, and also dumped a lot of wealth into building opulent church structures all over the Roman Empire, before that, Christians met in homes. And that should encourage us during COVID-19. We actually started out quite isolated from the mainstream. Christians learned how to pray before there was even a church building. That might be hard to believe, but it's a very comforting truth right now. Now, the short story is that we didn't start from scratch. We were given a solid foundation in Jewish scriptures and practice, and we gradually developed set prayer hours with an emphasis ending or landing on morning prayer and evening prayer for the non-professed monastic. Now, you can say goodbye if you don't want to hear the deeper levels of the story as I continue. So, for those who are staying, let's take a look at this very early period and see what we can glean for our own practices of prayer now. By the way, I'm adapting this from a class lecture I once gave. As I said, these early Christians didn't start from scratch. They continued to worship much like the Jewish worshippers. In fact, actually, the differentiation from Judaism and Christianity was a process of outworking that we see already in the New Testament and is still continuing on in some places in the empire in the 4th century. But I diverged. The first Christians were Jews, Jesus included, and his disciples and Paul. And in the 1st century, adult Jewish men recited the Shema twice daily, morning and evening. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord, and you shall love the Lord with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might. In addition, prayers were offered 3 times daily, either individually or in the synagogue. These prayers were blessing prayers, like where Moses' father-in-law says to Moses, "Blessed be the Lord who has delivered you from the Egyptians." Perhaps most significantly, Christians inherited the Hebrew scriptures, which particularly in the Psalms admonished daily times of prayer. 7 times a day do I praise you is Psalm 119, verse 164. The Psalms are a Jewish prayer book. Now, in the New Testament, we read about early Christians observing Jewish prayer customs by meeting in the temple and observing prayer at set times in the day. Luke 24:53, they were continually in the temple blessing God. Acts 2:46, Christians were attending the temple day by day and breaking bread in their houses. Acts 3:1 shows John and Peter going to the temple at, quote, the 9th hour or 3 in the afternoon. In Acts 2:1, all the Christians were together in one place, presumably in a home, and as well Acts 4:31. And finally in Acts 12:12, they were gathered in the house of Mary praying, and then Peter comes, miraculously delivered from prison. He knocks on the door and they don't let him in out of disbelief. Now, fast forward from the spread of Christianity beyond Jerusalem, where we're moving from the New Testament to the early Christian world. If we travel all the way to Alexandria in the Delta Nile, we encounter 2 figures from the 2nd and 3rd century. So a century after, or kind of overlapping some with New Testament period, we have Clement and his student Origen. Both of these authors are noting the prayer times of prime and the subsequent hours, terce, sext, none, and also midnight prayer. Clement notes prayers at rising, prayers at bedtime, and even prayers at mealtimes. And Origen prescribes that Christians should pray at least 3 times daily. Now, in the same period, if we travel from Alexandria all the way over to Africa, Northwest Africa, to Carthage at the coastline of the Mediterranean, we find a guy named Tertullian who asserts that there are actually no rules laid down for Christians concerning regular prayers, but he encourages prayers at the 3rd, 6th, and 9th hours, adding that there are in fact statutory prayers, namely those due at the coming of daylight and night. And Tertullian's contemporary Cyprian spoke of prayer and psalms, interestingly, at meals. Now in Rome, heading over to Italy, around the year 215, there's a text called the Apostolic Tradition, and it's believed to be written by a certain Hippolytus. Like, who doesn't love that name? There is a unique emphasis on the hours of Jesus' passion as providing the framework for prayer. He explains, if you're at home at the 3rd hour, you should pray to God and offer him praise. For it is the time when Christ was nailed to the cross. In the same way, you should pray at the 6th hour, thinking of Christ hanging on the cross while the sun was checked in its course and darkness reigned. And at the 9th hour, your prayer and praise should be protracted. It was this time that Christ, pierced with the spear, poured forth water and blood. Hippolytus also exhorts Christians to pray before going to bed, to get up again at midnight to pray, and to rise at the break of dawn. We don't need to systematize this info, so don't worry about keeping track of all of it. There's, like I say, a general pattern that emerges for lay Christians who are not professed monastics, worshiping in the monastery day in and day out, where it seemed most practical for the morning prayer hour and the evening prayer hour to stay, and then if you can, at your workplace, to sort of observe the smaller prayer hours throughout the day as your vocation may allow, if it's only to bring into remembrance a moment from Christ's passion. So the point is that these early church figures like us were trying to hold in tension a tradition of praying at set hours alongside the biblical command from Thessalonians to pray continually. And so we can ask ourselves, how are we, in our life situation during COVID and beyond, going to pray continually? In the words of Origen, the whole life of a saint, another name for Christian, is of one great unbroken prayer. Or we can echo the words of Tertullian, who said, no rules at all have been laid down, except, of course, to pray at every time and place. This was all well before churches. So in this time of COVID, what is your prayer practice going to be of praying without ceasing? This is my lovely set here. It's not very sophisticated. So the question is, in this time of COVID, what is your prayer practice going to be of prayer without ceasing? It's something we can think about in this season. And something that you may want to do actually is just to sort of flip through some of these prayer books that we have in our tradition most readily available, which is the Book of Common Prayer. There's a beautiful Compline service at the end of this. There's a noon prayer service in the BAS, and you might want to start exploring what you already have at your fingertips in terms of incorporating prayer hours at different times of the day into your life, into your faith life. Now, the blessing for us is that we will actually, Lord willing, be able to gather again. And we will be encouraged when we can pray together in our churches and outside of our churches. And at that time, we will be like those who lived in the 4th century, and hopefully along with Eusebius, we might be able to exclaim, as he did about the 4th century, the practice of singing psalms in the name of the Lord is observed everywhere. For this commandment to sing psalmody is in force in all the church existing among the peoples in the whole world, in towns and villages, as well as in the fields. In a word, in all the church, the peoples of Christ gathered in all the nations, and they sing with loud voice hymns and psalms. Oh, I forgot to mention one thing that I do want to give you, which is if you're not satisfied with trying to flip, or frustrated with trying to flip through these prayer books, we may upload some more services from them, or other prayer services within the Anglican Communion and perhaps even beyond, maybe from the Benedictine tradition, as I've already done. But something very helpful that you might like to do is simply open the book of the Psalms and use those as an entry point for having a conversation with God. Thank you, and have a great day. And remember, don't tell Kyle that I have uploaded this video. Bye for now.